Okay, we're nearing the end of the journey on our kidney. We have previously discussed filtration. We can label where these are coming from. The glomerulus is where we're going to see filtration. We've also discussed the fact that here in the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, this is where we get the most reabsorption. Down here in the loop of Henle, this is all about getting the last bit of water and salt that we weren't able to do passively. And now we're going to move on to this area right here. There are differences certainly with the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. We're just going to focus on the collecting duct primarily and what it has to offer. So what we want to do is we want to zoom in. And from previous discussions, we recognize that the collecting duct serves two primary purposes. Number one, this is fine-tuning water reabsorption and ion balance. And the ions in particular are going to be sodium and potassium. We haven't talked yet about potassium, but this is going to be an important place where potassium is regulated. And number two, this is all about pH homeostasis, making sure that the body stays at a consistent pH around 7.4. So let's see how this might work. We have, if this were the collecting duct that we just zoomed in on, let's put over on this side the blood. Let's list this collecting duct. And let's start with the first role, which is the fine-tuning of water and ions. And to do that, let us come in and examine this cell right here called the principal cell. We'll write it over here. The principal cell is responsible for water and salt. And it does it in coordination with two key hormones that will be discussed at another time. Aldosterone, which comes from the kidney, or the adrenal gland on top of the kidney, and ADH, or vasopressin. This is coming from the pituitary. Both of these, being endocrine hormones, are going to travel through the blood. And so, if you recall from the renin-angiotensin aldosterone, from the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, this is activated by low blood pressure. Aldosterone, as it's released from the adrenal gland on the kidney, so here's the kidney. The adrenal gland is this little pyramidal shaped gland sitting right on top of the kidney. And it's going to travel from the adrenal gland and interact with these cells, the principal cells in the kidney. So here comes aldosterone. And it's going to have two effects. First and foremost, it is going to upregulate the number and activity of the sodium-potassium pump. So aldosterone is going to come in and stimulate the sodium-potassium pump. And we know what the sodium-potassium pump does. It's going to pump 3 sodium out in exchange for 2 potassium ions in. This will be upregulated by aldosterone. The other thing that aldosterone is going to do is increase the number of channels on the luminal surface for sodium. Essentially sodium leak channels. This is now something that will allow sodium to come right through the cell. These are both done by aldosterone. So in the presence of aldosterone, the ATP sodium-potassium pump gets upregulated, creating a steeper gradient for sodium, and I also make the cell more permeable to sodium, allowing sodium to come from the filtrate through the cell and back into the blood. This is critical because remember, what are we trying to do? We're trying to increase water reabsorption, and we know that water follows salt. This in and of itself will pull water around the cells to allow it to get into the blood. But that's not the best way to move water. We know that water, because it's polar, doesn't readily cross through the cell membrane. Rather, it needs aquaporins. And this is where our second hormone comes in. This hormone is ADH, so antidiuretic hormone, and this comes from the pituitary. Also, as an endocrine signaler, ADH will be found in the blood. And as ADH acts on these cells, ADH does something very unique. It stimulates the exocytosis of vesicles that are loaded with aquaporins. These red lines here represent aquaporin channels embedded in the membrane, waiting to be exocytosed. In the presence of ADH, what's going to happen, we'll see the fusion of these vesicles with the cell membrane. And of course, because they were loaded with these aquaporins, what that does is it places the aquaporins inside the cell membrane, on the luminal surface. These aquaporins allow for increased water movement. Now we can see how aldosterone and ADH work together. Aldosterone increases the salt gradient, and ADH increases permeability to water, allowing water more readily to follow that salt. Now there's one thing that I want you to recognize, and that is, in addition to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system as a means of causing aldosterone secretion, aldosterone in and of itself can also be caused by high potassium. So if K plus is high, that will lead to an increase in aldosterone. Now, why might that be beneficial? Well, again, if aldosterone is turned on, look what it's going to do. It's going to be pumping and creating a steeper gradient for potassium on the inside of the cell. We have luminal channels on the surface for that potassium to leave through. So this is the body's primary way of regulating the concentrations of potassium inside the body.